Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're not chasing scandal, shock, or forbidden headlines. Tonight, we're listening to the quiet places where history chose not to speak. In medieval courts, queens bent the rules through power. In winter halls, Christmas loosened order through ritual. Long before that, Rome legalized chaos through Saturnalia. And when all those systems failed, there was silence. This is not a story about excess. It's a story about how societies survive desire, fear, and contradiction by deciding who is allowed to break the rules, when they are allowed to forget them, and who must quietly clean up afterward. Tonight's journey moves gently through hidden queens, sanctioned celebrations, ancient festivals, and finally arrives with the medieval midwife, the woman who stood between law and life, morality and reality, memory and forgetting. These chapters are connected by one invisible thread. When rules cannot fully control human nature, societies do not eliminate desire, they manage it. Some through authority, some through tradition, some through ritual, and some through silence. This is a soft history for sleep, not about what was written, but about what was allowed and what was deliberately left unwritten. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. Let the noise of the day loosen its grip, and let history tell you what it usually whispers after the world falls quiet. In the Middle Ages, silence was not innocence, it was protection. When night settled over the stone castles of Europe, the rules of the world did not disappear. They simply stopped being spoken aloud. Heavy doors closed, tapestries absorbed whispers, candlelight softened faces that history would later describe as rigid, pious, and unmoving. But behind those walls lived women whose lives were shaped by expectation more tightly than iron rings or jeweled crowns. Medieval queens were not merely symbols of power. They were vessels of order. Their bodies, their marriages, their words, even their emotions were expected to serve stability, lineage, and divine approval. Yet history, when listened to carefully, reveals something quieter beneath the official record. It reveals that desire did not vanish simply because it was forbidden. It learned how to hide. Queens of the medieval world lived under moral scrutiny unmatched by almost anyone else. A peasant's sins were personal. A queen's perceived failure could become political, theological, even apocalyptic in the eyes of chroniclers. Her purity was tied to dynasties. Her loyalty was equated with national survival. And so public life demanded restraint beyond imagination. But power, especially when wrapped in sanctity, creates shadows where rules soften. Behind the formality of court ritual existed long corridors of silence where forbidden relationships could breathe without names. Love affairs were rarely written as love. They appeared as rumors, sudden exiles, unexplained promotions, or erased individuals. The records do not shout scandal, they whisper omission. When historians later described certain queens as perverted, they often meant something far more revealing than excess. They meant deviation from an impossible ideal. To step outside the narrow role assigned to royal women was, in itself, treated as moral collapse. But what truly unsettles modern readers is not what these queens did, but how the system responded. Chronicles pause, letters vanish, accusations appear without evidence and dissolve without resolution. silence becomes a tool. In many courts, power did not erase desire, it insulated it. A queen could not openly rebel against her role, but she could exist within a carefully maintained ambiguity. Relationships that could never be acknowledged publicly were managed quietly, absorbed into the machinery of court life. Servants knew what not to repeat. Confessors heard what could never be recorded. The court learned to look away. This was not indulgence, it was containment. Medieval society did not believe it could eliminate human longing. Instead, it created protected spaces where rules bent just enough to prevent collapse. Queens stood at the center of this contradiction. They embodied virtue while navigating lives that could never fully align with doctrine. Their silence was not weakness, it was survival. And in many cases, it was protection for everyone involved. To accuse a queen openly was to destabilize a kingdom. To ignore her private life was to preserve order. So history learned to speak indirectly. It labeled women as immoral without explaining how. It hinted at excess without describing acts. It preserved the appearance of righteousness while quietly acknowledging human reality. This is why the lives of medieval queens feel distant and strangely hollow on the page. What is missing is intentional. The absence is the story. Desire existed, but only where language dared not follow. And as we begin this journey through medieval courts, festivals, ancient rituals, and the quiet witnesses of women's lives, remember this gentle truth. The past was not silent because nothing happened. It was silent because too much was at stake to say it out loud. In medieval courts, truth rarely arrived as a statement. It arrived as a pause, a hesitation, a name quietly removed from records. When queens were accused of excess, impropriety, or moral failure, the accusations often floated without detail, untethered from evidence. This was not carelessness, it was design. Medieval chroniclers understood something deeply unsettling about power. To describe it too clearly was to threaten it. And so they learned to gesture instead of explain. A queen might suddenly be described as influential beyond measure or surrounded by unwise counsel. A trusted companion might vanish from court without comment. A marriage once praised would cool into ceremonial distance. None of this needed explanation. Everyone within the court understood the language of omission. Silence in this world carried meaning more precisely than confession ever could. The idea of a perverted queen was not born from explicit acts, but from fear. Fear of women whose proximity to power disrupted the fragile illusion of control. Queens were expected to embody restraint while existing at the center of desire, diplomacy, and lineage. They were symbols of purity in environments saturated with ambition. Any deviation, real or imagined, unsettled the balance. But medieval society did not confront this discomfort openly. Instead, it built a system where whispers replaced evidence. Rumor became a tool that allowed anxiety to circulate without forcing action. A queen could be suspected endlessly without ever being formally accused. This preserved both authority and morality, at least on the surface. Behind the walls of castles, intimacy existed in forms the church officially condemned, yet pragmatically tolerated. Confessors heard truths they could never repeat. Advisors calculated consequences rather than ethics. Servants observed patterns and learned when to avert their eyes. In this environment, queens navigated their lives carefully, not because they were reckless, but because they were constrained. Desire did not erupt as rebellion, it flowed quietly through the cracks of an inflexible structure. What modern audiences often mistake as scandal was, in its time, survival within impossible boundaries.
Queens were not free to be human, yet they were never allowed to forget that they were. The contradiction was relentless. Their silence became a method of self-preservation. Their discretion protected not only themselves, but dynasties that could collapse under public shame. This is why medieval records feel incomplete. They were never meant to be whole. Chroniclers wrote for stability, not honesty. They understood that too much clarity could unravel alliances, invite rebellion, or undermine the divine narrative that justified rule. So instead of stories, they left shadows. And in those shadows lived the private lives of queens, shaped by longing, loneliness, and the constant awareness that visibility could be fatal. To call these women perverted is to misunderstand the era entirely. What history labels as moral failure was often the result of being trapped between expectation and reality. These queens did not challenge the system openly because the cost was too high. Instead, they moved within it, learning its blind spots, its silences, and its unspoken agreements. Medieval power was not rigid, it was brittle, and everyone involved knew it. That is why so much was left unsaid, because silence was not denial, it was maintenance. And as we listen to these quiet absences centuries later, we begin to hear what medieval society could not allow itself to say, that order was never natural. It was negotiated daily through secrecy, restraint, and carefully preserved illusions.
Power in the medieval world was rarely intimate. For queens, it was almost never comforting. Royal marriages were not unions of affection, but rituals designed to stabilize borders, secure alliances, and produce heirs whose existence justified entire wars. A queen entered marriage not as a partner, but as a symbol. Her body became a public instrument. Her emotions, if acknowledged at all, were expected to remain private and contained. This separation between role and self created a loneliness that history seldom names directly. Medieval queens lived surrounded by people, yet deeply alone. Every gesture was observed, every silence interpreted, yet no one was permitted to truly see them. In such an environment, desire did not always take the form of rebellion or excess. More often, it appeared as a quiet search for recognition, warmth, or simple humanity. To modernize, later accusations of impropriety can seem exaggerated or moralistic. But within the medieval context, even emotional closeness outside sanctioned structures was treated as dangerous. Love itself was regulated. Affection without political function was suspicious. A queen who formed attachments beyond her ceremonial marriage threatened the fiction that royal order was effortless and divinely endorsed. And so, when chronicles hint at inappropriate closeness or undue influence, they are often pointing not to scandal, but to discomfort. The discomfort of a system forced to confront the emotional reality it tried to erase. Loneliness became one of the most powerful, unspoken forces shaping queens' lives. Cut off from genuine intimacy, expected to perform devotion without receiving it, many queens learned to navigate court life through carefully chosen confidences. These relationships were rarely equal. They existed under constant risk, but they provided something the crown could not: presence. In this sense, what history later labeled as moral failure often began as survival. The court itself encouraged this contradiction. It demanded queens embody virtue while denying them the conditions that make virtue humane. Ritual replaced affection. Ceremony replaced connection. Over time, this created a strange double life. Publicly, the queen was untouchable. Privately, she remained painfully human. Medieval society preferred not to acknowledge this fracture. To do so would be to admit that its ideals were incompatible with lived experience.
So instead, it transformed private coping into public accusation. Silence again played its role. A queen's loneliness could not be recorded. Her longing could not be explained. Only the resulting suspicion was preserved. This is why the term perverted tells us more about medieval anxiety than medieval behavior. It reveals a culture deeply uneasy with female interiority, especially when paired with power. Queens were expected to be visible symbols, not complex individuals. When they failed to conform perfectly, the narrative shifted from empathy to judgment. Yet beneath this judgment lies a quieter truth. Medieval queens were not seeking excess, they were seeking balance in lives stripped of choice. Their supposed transgressions often mirrored the freedoms quietly granted to men of the same rank. But because women embodied morality itself, their deviations felt existentially threatening. And so the system responded not with transparency, but with controlled ambiguity. Accusations lingered, details dissolved, memory blurred. This preserved order while sacrificing understanding. As listeners centuries later, we are left not with clear stories, but with emotional outlines. And perhaps that is fitting, because the lives of these queens were lived in outline as well, defined by ritual, constrained by silence, and haunted by the simple human desire to be seen without consequence.
By the end of the Middle Ages, the word perverted had become less a description of behavior and more a signal of unease. It was a way for society to point at something it could not comfortably explain. When chroniclers used it in reference to queens, they were not documenting acts, they were managing anxiety. Medieval systems of order relied on the belief that hierarchy, morality, and divine will moved in harmony. Queens, as visible embodiments of that harmony, were expected to confirm it simply by existing. When their private realities strained against this expectation, language stepped in to soften the contradiction. Instead of acknowledging structural impossibility, society personalized the tension. It became the queen's flaw, not the system's failure. This reframing was essential for stability. To admit that the role itself was inhuman would have unraveled far more than reputations. It would have questioned the legitimacy of power itself. And so, the label endured. Perverted did not mean uncontrolled desire. It meant uncontained humanity. It marked moments when emotional truth leaked through ritual, when lived experience pressed against doctrine. Queens were not uniquely indulgent, they were uniquely visible. And visibility, in a culture built on appearances, was dangerous. The court needed figures who could absorb contradiction without forcing reform. Queens served this purpose quietly. Their rumored excesses allowed society to discharge discomfort without altering structure. Blame was localized, order remained intact. This mechanism did not resolve tension, it postponed it. Over time, medieval culture learned that suppression alone was unsustainable. Complete restraint bred instability. Human impulse, denied entirely, returned in unpredictable ways. This realization did not lead to openness, it led to scheduling. Desire, chaos, and inversion were not eliminated, they were relocated, carefully, temporarily, elsewhere. This is where the story quietly turns. The same society that demanded queens embody constant virtue also created sanctioned moments where virtue could rest. Festivals, holy days, and ritualized disorder emerged as pressure valves. They allowed what could not exist daily to exist briefly, safely, predictably, and crucially, away from those whose visibility threatened the myth of order. Queens could not openly participate in release. Their role was continuity. But the system that constrained them understood the need for release intimately.
It simply redirected it. This is why medieval morality feels both severe and strangely permissive. The contradiction was intentional. Control was never absolute, it was managed. When we look back at queens labeled as immoral, we are not witnessing personal failure. We are seeing the early cracks in a structure learning how to survive its own rigidity. Their stories sit at the threshold between repression and ritual, between silence and permission. And as this chapter closes, we can sense the culture preparing a different solution. If desire could not be erased from individuals, perhaps it could be contained within time itself. A day, a season, a holy celebration. The courts would remain silent, the crown would remain pure, and elsewhere the rules would briefly loosen. Not because morality had changed, but because humanity required space to breathe. This is how medieval society preserved itself, not by denying human nature, but by carefully deciding when it was allowed to appear.
As the medieval night deepened around stone walls and quiet corridors, silence settled into its final role. It was no longer merely a shield for queens, nor only a tool of the court. It became a shared agreement between power and society, an understanding that certain truths would remain unspoken, not because they were rare, but because they were universal. By the time chroniclers finished their careful omissions, the image of the queen stood preserved, serene, distant, morally intact. And yet, beneath that image lived a woman navigating constraints few could survive without fracture. What history chose to remember was not her inner life, but the stability her silence helped maintain. Medieval society did not require queens to be flawless, it required them to be quiet. In this quiet, contradictions could coexist without demanding resolution. Desire could exist without acknowledgement. Loneliness could persist without remedy. The system depended on this balance. Too much exposure would have forced reform. Too much repression would have invited collapse. Silence held the center. And so queens became living boundaries, markers of how much humanity could be concealed before order trembled. They were not celebrated for restraint, nor punished consistently for deviation. Instead, they were surrounded by narrative fog, enough ambiguity to protect power, enough suspicion to satisfy moral anxiety. This was not accidental. It was refined over generations. Over time, medieval culture internalized this pattern. It learned that perfection was unsustainable, but illusion was not. The role of the queen crystallized into something symbolic rather than personal. Her presence reassured. Her silence absorbed tension. Her rumored transgressions carried the weight of what society could not confront directly. And in doing so, they allowed the broader structure to remain intact. This is why the term perverted lingers without clarity. It was never meant to explain, it was meant to close discussion, to signal that boundaries existed and had been crossed, without forcing anyone to examine where those boundaries truly lay. As this chapter draws to a close, we can sense a quiet shift approaching. Medieval society had learned that silence alone could not contain everything. Human impulse pressed outward. It required release. But release could not come from those who embodied order itself. It had to be displaced, temporarily, ritualistically, safely. And so, while queens remained bound to continuity, elsewhere the world prepared its pauses. Moments when rules would soften without breaking, when laughter, excess, and inversion could occur without threatening the crown. The story of these queens is not of scandal, but of management.
the management of desire, visibility, and fear. Their silence was not empty, it was heavy with purpose, and it carried medieval society forward into a new strategy, one that did not deny human nature, but confined it to carefully chosen times. As we leave the quiet chambers of the court behind, remember this: the stillness you feel is not peace, it is preparation. Because when silence can no longer hold, society does not shout, it celebrates.
Once a year, even God allowed the rules to loosen. This was how medieval people understood Christmas, not as a quiet retreat into holiness, but as a carefully measured pause in the weight of order. When winter pressed hard against stone towns and wooden villages, when nights grew longer than patience, society did not pretend that discipline alone could carry everyone through. Instead, it created a moment where restraint could rest. Medieval Christmas was not gentle, it was deliberate. Bells rang not only to summon prayer, but to signal permission. Permission to eat beyond need, to drink beyond caution, to laugh beyond decorum. What appears to modern eyes as contradiction was, in its time, coherence. The same world that demanded obedience throughout the year also understood the danger of endless control. And so it offered a window where forgetting the rules was itself a rule. Streets filled with sound, fires burned longer, tables stretched with food that ordinary days would never allow. Masks appeared, jokes crossed lines that would normally invite punishment. Hierarchies softened, not erased, but blurred just enough to release pressure without breaking structure. Lords tolerated mockery. Clergy looked away from excess, not because authority weakened, but because it recognized its limits. Christmas functioned as a ritualized release, a sanctioned disorder designed to preserve order in the long run. This was not rebellion, it was maintenance. Medieval society did not imagine virtue as constant tension. It imagined virtue as endurance, supported by moments of relief. To deny those moments would invite something far more dangerous than laughter. It would invite fracture. The Church, often imagined as unyielding, played a central role in this balance. It set the calendar, it named the days, and within that structure, it allowed celebration to swell. Sermons warned against excess, even as feasts unfolded outside church doors. This apparent hypocrisy was understood as wisdom. People were not expected to transcend their bodies. They were expected to return to discipline after release. Christmas did not undermine faith, it protected it. By allowing indulgence briefly, the system prevented it from erupting uncontrollably elsewhere. In this sense, medieval Christmas reveals a deep psychological insight. Order is not sustained by suppression alone. It requires rhythm, tightening and loosening, silence and noise, fasting and feast. The people did not experience Christmas as a loss of morality, but as a return to balance. Laughter during the holy season was not seen as disrespect, it was seen as survival. And importantly, this release was shared. Unlike the private silences of queens, Christmas offered a communal forgetting. Everyone participated. No one stood alone with their longing. The burden of restraint lifted together, then settled back into place together. This collective rhythm prevented envy, resentment, and isolation from taking root. It reminded people that order was something they endured together, not something imposed without mercy. As we move deeper into this chapter, keep this quiet understanding in mind. Medieval Christmas was not chaos pretending to be joy. It was a carefully shaped pause, a moment where society breathed in unison. And when the bells finally quieted and the tables were cleared, the rules returned, not as punishment, but as familiar structure, because for one brief season, everyone had been allowed to forget them. During medieval Christmas,
The world did not collapse into chaos. It leaned sideways. For a brief stretch of days, the lines that usually separated lord from servant, priest from layperson, elder from youth, softened just enough to allow movement. This was not an accident. It was ritualized inversion, a social practice as old as hierarchy itself. People understood the tension accumulated quietly throughout the year. It gathered in bowed heads, in swallowed words, in obedience practiced without rest. Christmas offered a controlled release by allowing the world to turn slightly upside down. Servants joked about masters. Commoners mimicked authority. Songs carried humor that would otherwise be punished. These moments did not threaten power, they protected it. Laughter functioned as a safety valve. It allowed frustration to escape in forms that could be absorbed without damage. The temporary blurring of roles reassured everyone that hierarchy was flexible enough to survive human pressure. Importantly, this inversion was time-bound. It had a beginning and an end. Everyone knew when it started. Everyone knew when it would stop. This knowledge made participation safe. People could step outside their assigned places without fear of permanent consequence. And because it was shared, resentment did not concentrate. No single group carried the weight of release alone. The community breathed together. Medieval authorities understood this deeply. Allowing mockery for a few days prevented rebellion for the rest of the year. Humor replaced violence. Performance replaced confrontation. What might have erupted as anger instead dissolved into play. Christmas was not merely a celebration. It was a strategy, a way of acknowledging imbalance without correcting it. The Church's tolerance of this inversion was not weakness, it was calculation. By containing disorder within ritual, it preserved the sacred framework that surrounded it. People returned to obedience not humiliated, but refreshed. They had been seen, even briefly, and that recognition mattered. The quiet genius of medieval Christmas lay in its understanding of human psychology. Suppression without relief breeds rupture. Release without structure breeds instability. The balance between the two sustained societies that lacked modern outlets for dissent. When we imagine medieval life as uniformly grim, we miss these subtle mechanisms of care. Care not expressed through comfort, but through permission. Permission to laugh, to exaggerate, to momentarily forget one's place. This permission was not granted out of kindness alone. It was granted because it worked. It kept communities intact through long winters and harder years, and it did so without threatening the myth of order that held everything together. As the season unfolded, these inversions did not erase hierarchy. They reminded everyone of it by contrast. When normal life resumed, roles felt familiar again. The temporary freedom made structure tolerable. This rhythm, constraint followed by release, was the hidden heartbeat of medieval society. It allowed endurance without explosion. As we continue listening, notice how this pattern echoes the silences of queens and the rituals of courts. Different expressions, same principle. When rules cannot bend, they break. When they bend briefly, they endure. What made medieval Christmas so effective was not excess itself, but timing. Disorder was not accidental, it was scheduled, carefully placed within the calendar that governed every aspect of life. The Church did not merely tolerate celebration, it authored its boundaries. Feast days, holy nights, and sanctioned pauses were written into time itself, transforming indulgence from threat into structure. This was the quiet authority of the medieval calendar. It told people not only what to believe, but when to loosen their grip. In a world where most could not read, Time was learned through repetition. Bells marked hours, saints' days marked seasons, and Christmas marked a turning point where restraint could safely soften. By embedding release within sacred time, the Church ensured that indulgence did not challenge doctrine, it belonged to it. People did not feel they were breaking rules, they felt they were obeying a different one. This distinction mattered deeply. When behavior feels permitted, it does not accumulate guilt, it dissipates tension. Medieval leaders understood that guilt left unmanaged could turn corrosive. It could harden into resentment or spill into violence. The calendar prevented this by giving shape to human impulse. It said not now, but soon, not always, but briefly. In doing so, it taught patience. People endured long periods of scarcity and obedience because they trusted in approaching relief. Christmas did not arrive as surprise, it arrived as promise fulfilled. This rhythm made social endurance possible. The Church's power lay not only in moral instruction, but in its orchestration of time. By deciding when joy was allowed, it controlled how joy functioned. Celebration became predictable and therefore safe. Excess remained contained within boundaries everyone recognized. When the season ended, restraint resumed without rebellion. People returned to discipline not because they were forced, but because the rhythm made sense. This is why medieval Christmas rarely spiraled into permanent disorder. It was never free-floating. It was anchored to holy narrative: birth, light, renewal. The story framed behavior, and behavior in turn reinforced the story. Even moments of laughter were enclosed within meaning. This enclosure transformed chaos into ritual. It allowed society to experience relief without losing itself. As we listen, notice how different this is from modern assumptions about freedom. Medieval freedom was not continuous, it was cyclical. It appeared, disappeared, and returned. This cycle was not oppressive to those who lived within it, it was stabilizing. Knowing when release would come made endurance bearable, and knowing when it would end preserved trust. The Church did not fear joy, it managed it. By placing Christmas within the calendar, it turned human need into predictable motion. Time itself became the container. This approach echoes the silences we heard in royal courts. There, omission protected power. Here, scheduling protected order. Different tools, same principle. Human nature acknowledged, then carefully guided. As we move forward, this understanding will deepen, because the medieval world did not see contradiction where we might. It saw balance, control paired with compassion, discipline softened by permission. Christmas was not an escape from the system, it was proof that the system understood the people it governed.
As Christmas unfolded, permission did not remain confined to calendars or sermons. It moved outward, into rooms warmed by hearth fires, into taverns thick with breath and song, into village squares where footsteps erased the quiet of winter nights. The medieval world experienced release not as an abstract idea, but as a change in atmosphere. Doors stayed open longer, conversations stretched, the pace of life softened. Within homes, families gathered with an ease rarely possible during harsher seasons. Food was shared more generously. Stories lingered. The strict rhythms of labor loosened, replaced by an unspoken agreement that this time was different, not lawless, but lighter. In taverns, the shift became more visible. Music carried further than usual. Jokes grew bolder, but not reckless. Even those who normally watched their words felt the safety of shared indulgence. The presence of others mattered. Permission was communal. What could not be said alone could be laughed at together. This collective release transformed tension into warmth.
It did not erase hardship, but it made it bearable. Outside, in public squares, the effect was unmistakable. Performers appeared. Masks blurred identity. Temporary roles allowed people to step beyond themselves without consequence. These spaces did not undermine authority. They reinforced it by providing visibility to joy. Authority observed without intervening. Silence, earlier a tool of restraint, now became tolerance. The watchful eye remained, but it softened. This mattered deeply. People knew they were seen, yet not judged. The world felt momentarily generous. This generosity did not threaten order because it was bounded by place as well as time. When the season passed, rooms returned to routine, taverns to caution, squares to quiet. The memory of permission lingered just enough to sustain endurance. Medieval Christmas worked because it entered everyday life without trying to transform it permanently. It offered rest, not revolution. In this way, the festival touched every layer of society differently but coherently. For the wealthy, it was abundance. For the poor, it was relief. For everyone, it was recognition. Recognition that constant restraint was not the natural state of being human. By allowing joy to inhabit ordinary spaces, society acknowledged this truth without surrendering control. This spatial spread of permission mirrored the earlier silences of power. Where queens managed desire through omission, communities managed strain through presence. Both approaches sought the same outcome: stability without fracture. As we listen, notice how gently this system operated. No declarations were necessary. No laws were rewritten. People simply felt the shift. And feeling, in a world governed by ritual, was enough. Christmas did not demand belief in joy. It created conditions where joy could appear naturally. And in appearing, it reminded everyone why the rules existed in the first place. Not to deny life, but to hold it together.
As the Christmas season slowly drew to a close, the medieval world did not snap back into discipline. It settled. The transition mattered. Fires burned a little lower. Songs softened. Laughter thinned into memory. This gentle return was as intentional as the celebration itself. Order was not reimposed abruptly because it had never truly left. It had merely stepped aside. People understood this intuitively. The end of Christmas was not punishment, it was completion. The rhythm had run its course. What remained was a sense of having been held, briefly, by something lighter than duty. Medieval society relied on this feeling. It allowed people to return to labor and restraint without bitterness. The memory of permission lingered like warmth in stone walls long after the hearth had cooled. This memory was essential. It reassured individuals that endurance was shared and finite, that relief would come again. The calendar promised it. In this way, Christmas functioned not only as release, but as reassurance. The system did not forget its people, it remembered them on schedule. Authority regained its firmness without resistance because it had already demonstrated mercy. People complied not because they were broken, but because they felt included. This inclusion was subtle but powerful. It transformed obedience from submission into participation. When discipline resumed, it felt familiar rather than oppressive. The brief softness of the season gave structure emotional credibility. Without it, rules would have hardened into resentment. With it, they felt survivable. Medieval Christmas achieved something remarkable. It allowed joy without destabilization, excess without chaos, inversion without revolt, and then it let all of it fade without loss.
This fading was crucial. Release that lingers too long becomes expectation. Expectation breeds disappointment. By ending the celebration deliberately, society preserved its effectiveness. The return to order did not erase what had happened, it absorbed it. People carried the experience forward quietly, drawing strength from it in months to come. This is why medieval Christmas was not remembered as disorder, but as tradition. It became part of identity, a shared understanding passed down through repetition. Each year reinforced the lesson. Control could coexist with compassion. Silence could coexist with laughter. The end of Christmas did not feel like closing a door. It felt like placing something gently back where it belonged. And as this chapter settles into stillness, we can sense the continuity forming. The medieval world had not invented release, it had inherited it. Long before Christian calendars shaped time, older cultures understood the need to suspend order briefly. The story does not end here, it deepens. Beneath Christmas lies an older rhythm, one that celebrated inversion more openly, more boldly. As the candles dim and the season sleeps, the memory of permission prepares us for what came before. Because the medieval pause was not the beginning, it was an echo. And the echo leads us further back, into the ancient world, where the rules did not merely loosen for a moment, they reversed. Before Christmas loosened the rules, Rome already knew how. Long before church bells marked holy pauses, before medieval calendars learned to soften discipline, the ancient Roman world practiced something far more direct. Saturnalia was not a quiet relaxation of order. It was an agreement to put order down. For a few days each winter, the machinery of Roman life slowed, then reversed, not out of carelessness, but out of understanding. Romans believed that stability was not maintained by constant control. It was maintained by remembering what control was holding back. Saturnalia honored Saturn, an old god from an older age, associated with abundance, equality, and a time before strict hierarchies hardened into law. During the festival, Rome symbolically returned to that imagined past. Social distinctions blurred, authority stepped aside, and for a moment the city remembered itself without structure. This remembrance was not nostalgia, it was strategy. In ordinary time, Rome functioned on obedience, hierarchy, and relentless discipline. Slaves labored, citizens competed, magistrates enforced. The weight of order was immense. Saturnalia acknowledged that such weight, left uninterrupted, would crush the spirit that sustained the state. So the Romans created a space where freedom was not whispered or hidden, but declared. Slaves were allowed to speak freely. Masters served meals. Mockery was expected. Rules were not broken secretly, they were suspended openly. This distinction mattered. Saturnalia was not rebellion pretending to be celebration. It was celebration protecting against rebellion. By legalizing inversion, Rome prevented it from erupting unpredictably. The festival created a boundary around chaos, shaping it into something knowable and safe. Within that boundary, laughter replaced resentment. Play replaced protest. For a few days, people could experience the world differently without imagining it permanently altered. And because everyone participated, no single group carried the burden of release alone. The city breathed together. This collective inversion did not weaken Roman authority, it strengthened it. When the festival ended, roles returned with renewed clarity. The memory of freedom made discipline tolerable again. Saturnalia worked because it did not pretend humans could be disciplined forever. It recognized the need for rhythm, constraint followed by release, silence followed by voice, order followed by its opposite. The Romans did not see this as contradiction, they saw it as balance. The genius of Saturnalia lies in its honesty. Unlike later societies that hid excess behind moral language, Rome named its need openly. It said, "For these days the rules are not forgotten, they are set aside." And in setting them aside deliberately, Rome preserved them. As we listen to this ancient rhythm, we can feel how deeply it echoes through time. Medieval Christmas softened rules quietly. Saturnalia removed them loudly. Different expressions, same human truth. Order is strongest when it remembers what it is made of. As this chapter begins, let the image settle gently. A city pausing, a world briefly turned upside down, not to destroy itself, but to survive another year unchanged.
So, during Saturnalia, the most striking transformation was not the noise, the feasting, or the color. It was the reversal of voice. In ordinary Roman life, speech followed power. Masters commanded, slaves obeyed. Silence was enforced as firmly as labor. But during the festival, this order shifted in a way that felt almost unreal. Slaves were permitted to speak freely, not cautiously, not symbolically, freely. They could joke, complain, tease, and even criticize their masters without fear of punishment. In some households, masters served meals to those who served them the rest of the year. This was not theater meant to mock the enslaved. It was a ritual that acknowledged a truth Rome preferred not to confront daily. Domination required suppression, and suppression accumulated pressure. Saturnalia did not challenge slavery as an institution, it did something more subtle. It recognized the psychological cost of hierarchy. By allowing temporary equality, Rome released tension without dismantling structure. This is what made the inversion safe. It was limited, it was expected, and it was shared. Slaves knew the reversal would end, masters knew it would end. That knowledge prevented the experience from turning into revolt. Instead, it became catharsis. For slaves, the permission to speak restored a sense of personhood, however briefly. For masters, listening, while uncomfortable, served as a reminder of the human cost embedded in authority. This mutual awareness did not weaken the system, it stabilized it. Saturnalia created a space where resentment could be expressed as humor rather than violence. Laughter softened what anger might have sharpened. The law's suspension did not erase power, it reframed it. Rome understood that absolute silence breeds danger. When people are never allowed to speak, they eventually speak through destruction. Saturnalia prevented that by opening a controlled channel. Freedom was not granted permanently, but it was acknowledged, and acknowledgement mattered. This ritual honesty set Rome apart from later cultures that relied more heavily on denial. The Romans were pragmatic. They did not imagine hierarchy as morally pure. They imagined it as necessary and heavy. Saturnalia lightened that weight without pretending it disappeared. The temporary equality of the festival did not promise change, it promised relief, and relief was enough to renew compliance. After the festival, slaves returned to their roles, not because they had forgotten freedom, but because freedom had been experienced and safely contained. Masters resumed authority, not because it was unquestioned, but because it had proven flexible enough to bend without breaking. This elasticity was the genius of Roman social control. By legalizing reversal, Rome prevented chaos from becoming unpredictable. The inversion was not chaos itself, it was a structure for chaos. It allowed society to touch its opposite
without being consumed by it. As listeners, we may feel discomfort at this honesty. Modern moral frameworks often seek either reform or condemnation. Rome sought neither during Saturnalia. It sought balance. It understood that stability depended not on purity, but on rhythm. Voice followed silence, equality followed dominance, and then dominance returned with less friction. As this part of the story settles, notice how clearly this echoes what came later. Medieval courts hid desire behind silence. Medieval Christmas softened hierarchy quietly. Saturnalia did neither. It spoke openly. It inverted visibly. It trusted ritual to contain what repression could not. This trust did not make Rome kinder. It made Rome durable.
As Saturnalia deepened, something subtle yet profound occurred within the Roman mind. Law did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. This distinction mattered. Romans did not imagine a world without rules. They imagined a world where rules could step aside temporarily without being destroyed. During the festival, formal disciplines softened into suggestion. Normal prohibitions were relaxed. Speech became freer, movement less watched. The city felt lighter, not because it forgot itself, but because it allowed itself to rest. Masks played a quiet role in this transformation. When identity blurred, responsibility softened without disappearing. A masked face could speak truths that an uncovered one could not. This anonymity was not meant to erase accountability forever. It was meant to let tension breathe. Games and playful contests filled the streets, not as distractions, but as ritual channels. Competition without consequence allowed energy to discharge safely. The Romans understood that chaos left unstructured becomes dangerous, but chaos shaped into play becomes manageable. Saturnalia legalized this principle. It offered a framework where disorder could exist without spreading. The suspension of law was never total. Violence was not encouraged. Boundaries remained even as they shifted. This careful calibration was essential. Too much freedom would threaten cohesion. Too little would render the ritual meaningless. Saturnalia balanced on this edge with remarkable precision. People felt free yet safe, watched yet unjudged. The state remained present but distant. This distance was intentional. Authority did not disappear. It observed quietly, trusting the ritual to do its work. And it did. By allowing citizens to experience a world momentarily freed from rigid surveillance, Saturnalia reduced the urge to resist surveillance later. People returned to order with less friction because they had known its absence. This is the paradox of Roman control. Freedom was not the enemy of authority. Unmanaged freedom was. Saturnalia transformed freedom into a scheduled experience, predictable and contained. This made it harmless. The festival taught Romans that rules were not arbitrary cruelty, but tools that could be set down and picked up again. That understanding fostered compliance more effectively than fear alone ever could. As listeners, we may sense how modern this insight feels. The Romans anticipated something later societies would struggle to articulate, that people do not rebel against order itself, but against unrelenting order. Saturnalia answered that problem centuries before psychology named it. By offering legal chaos, Rome allowed its people to sleep easier the rest of the year. Anxiety dissipated through laughter, frustration through play, identity through masks. When the festival ended, masks were removed without resistance, games stopped without resentment, law returned without violence. This return was the measure of success. Saturnalia did not promise freedom as a future, it offered it as a pause, and in doing so, it preserved the future unchanged. As we continue, let the image settle softly, a city where rules step aside without collapsing, where chaos is invited, then gently escorted out.
This was not weakness, it was wisdom practiced quietly.
When we place Saturnalia beside medieval Christmas, the connection becomes impossible to ignore. Not as a matter of dates or decorations, but as a shared understanding of human endurance. Saturnalia did not disappear when Rome declined. Its shape changed, its language softened, its volume lowered, but its purpose survived. As Christian calendars replaced pagan ones, the need Saturnalia addressed did not vanish, it adapted. What Rome legalized openly, medieval society allowed quietly. The structure remained, only the tone shifted. Where Saturnalia announced inversion with laughter and masks, Christmas folded release into ritual and devotion. Where Roman slaves spoke freely, medieval hierarchies softened without words. But the same principle guided both worlds. Order cannot be uninterrupted. It must breathe. Early Christian leaders understood this more clearly than later moral narratives suggest. They did not invent Christmas as pure opposition to pagan festivals. They absorbed what worked: the winter pause, the sanctioned excess, the collective release. These elements were not accidents of conversion. They were acknowledgments of continuity. The human body and mind did not change when theology did. Hunger, fatigue, resentment, and longing persisted, and so the calendar continued to offer relief even as its stories changed. Saturnalia's loud inversion became Christmas's gentle permission. The masks disappeared, but laughter remained. The legal suspension of law transformed into moral leniency. The structure survived because it had always been functional. This continuity explains why Christmas never became purely solemn. Even at its most devout, it allowed warmth, feasting, song, a bending of usual restraint. These were not failures of discipline, they were inheritances. Saturnalia taught the ancient world that stability required interruption. Christianity translated that lesson into quieter forms. The result was not contradiction, but refinement. Medieval society did not need to declare chaos legal. It had learned to contain it through silence, ritual, and shared understanding. What had once been shouted could now be whispered, but it was still heard. This is why the undercurrent connecting Queens, Christmas, and Saturnalia feels seamless. Each chapter reveals a different strategy for managing the same truth. Power generates pressure. Pressure seeks release. Societies survive by choosing how that release appears. Rome chose spectacle. The Middle Ages chose permission. Neither eliminated desire. Both prevented it from tearing the system apart. As listeners, we may sense something deeply familiar here. Modern life, too, oscillates between control and escape, work and holiday, silence and celebration. The ancient pattern persists because it addresses something permanent. Saturnalia was not a primitive excess overcome by civilization. It was an insight refined over centuries. Christmas did not replace it, it inherited it. And in inheriting it, it softened it enough to endure longer. As this part settles, notice how the noise fades. The laughter of Rome becomes the hush of medieval halls. The masks fall away, the candles remain. But beneath every form, the same rhythm pulses quietly. A reminder that no system survives by denying the human need to pause. The past did not disappear,
it learned how to sleep.
As Saturnalia drew to its close, Rome did not awaken to shock or disappointment. It returned to itself with familiarity. The laughter thinned. The masks were set aside. Servants resumed their duties. Masters reclaimed authority. Law returned to its place without force. This return was the measure of the festival's success. Saturnalia was never meant to linger. It was designed to pass. Its power lay in its ending. By allowing inversion to conclude gently, Rome transformed freedom into memory rather than demand. Memory is safer than expectation. Expectation destabilizes. Memory sustains. People carried the experience quietly into the months ahead, drawing strength from it when discipline pressed hard again. The festival did not promise change, it promised relief, and relief, properly timed, preserved endurance. This is why Saturnalia did not weaken Rome, it prolonged it. The city learned to survive by rehearsing its opposite. For a few days, hierarchy loosened. Then it returned clearer, not harsher. Those who had tasted freedom could tolerate its absence because it had been acknowledged. Those who held power could exercise it with less fear because it had proven flexible. This mutual reassurance was the unseen architecture of Roman stability. Saturnalia ended not with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude that the world could bend without breaking, that chaos could be invited without conquest, that joy could exist without permanence. The Romans understood something profoundly human. Control is not strengthened by denial, it is strengthened by release that knows when to stop. As the festival faded, what remained was not disorder, but balance restored. This restoration did not erase the experience, it integrated it. Over generations, this integration became tradition, and tradition, when it works, outlives its origins. Saturnalia's legacy did not require temples or sacrifices to survive. It required only remembrance, and remembrance traveled easily, from Rome to the medieval world, from loud inversion to quiet permission, from public spectacle to private understanding. The form changed, the function endured. As this chapter closes, notice how the rhythm settles into stillness. The city sleeps again. But beneath that sleep lies knowledge, that no order can survive without pause, that no discipline endures without mercy. Saturnalia taught this lesson openly. Later worlds learned to whisper it. And as we move forward, the story turns inward, away from festivals and crowds, toward rooms where life begins and ends quietly, toward women whose labor was never celebrated with feasts or laughter, yet whose endurance sustained generations. The pause ends, the rules return, and in their shadow, another kind of survival continues. Some people enforced the rules, others cleaned up after them. In the medieval world, few figures stood closer to the quiet truth of life than the midwife. She held no title, commanded no authority, wrote no laws, and appeared in no grand chronicles. Yet she was present at the moments history preferred not to record. When the world crossed its own boundaries, she was called. The medieval midwife lived at the edge of society's contradictions. Publicly, morality was rigid, doctrine was clear, order was preached. Privately, bodies failed to obey those ideals. Desire escaped. Fear intervened. Life arrived too early, too late, or not at all. The midwife stood where these truths met.
She did not ask permission, she was summoned. In dim rooms lit by firelight, she witnessed what power denied. Childbirth was her most visible role, but it was never only about birth. It was about survival. Women labored without anesthesia, without certainty, without safety. Death was common. Pain was expected. Silence was enforced. The midwife carried knowledge passed through hands, not books. She understood the body in ways institutions did not. She knew which herbs calmed contractions, which words steadied fear, which moments required haste, and which required waiting. This knowledge was practical, intimate, and unofficial. That made it dangerous, because where there is knowledge outside authority, there is power without recognition. The midwife's presence extended beyond sanctioned births. She was called when a pregnancy could not be explained, when a child could not be acknowledged, when a body bore evidence of a night that society refused to name. She did not judge, she assessed. Her role was not moral arbitration, it was containment. She helped women navigate between doctrine and reality, between what was allowed and what had already happened. In this way, she became the quiet witness to transgression. Affairs, assaults, forbidden unions, all passed through her hands without record. The midwife knew which children would be baptized publicly and which would vanish into anonymity, which names would be written and which would never be spoken. She was trusted not because she held virtue, but because she held discretion. Silence was her currency. Unlike queens who bent rules through power, or festivals that suspended rules through ritual, the midwife crossed boundaries through necessity. Her silence was not symbolic, it was survival. If she spoke too much, lives unraveled. If she spoke too little, deaths followed. She lived in a constant balance between revealing and concealing. This balance defined her existence. Medieval society relied on her precisely because it refused to acknowledge her fully. She was necessary, yet marginal, respected, yet watched, needed, yet feared, because she knew too much, and knowing too much in a world built on selective memory is dangerous. As listeners, we may sense how different this form of transgression feels. It is not loud, it is not celebrated, it does not invert order, it sustains it quietly. The midwife did not challenge morality, she absorbed its consequences. She was the human mechanism that allowed ideals to survive reality. As this chapter begins, let the image settle gently. A woman kneeling beside another woman in the dark. No audience, no record, only breath, pain, and whispered instruction. History rarely pauses here, but tonight we do, because without these unseen witnesses, the orderly world of the past could not have existed at all.
Beyond childbirth itself, the medieval midwife occupied a quieter, more dangerous territory. She was present where love became inconvenient and where consequence arrived without ceremony. Affairs were not rare in medieval society, they were merely unspeakable. Marriages were arranged for land, alliance, or survival, not intimacy. Desire often traveled elsewhere, silently, leaving traces the body could not hide. When pregnancy followed such desire, the midwife was summoned before anyone else. She arrived without questions. Her task was not to expose truth, but to manage it. In rooms sealed by secrecy, she assessed timelines, counted weeks, read signs written into flesh. She knew whether a child arrived early or late, whether the story offered would hold. This knowledge placed her in a position of quiet authority.
She could protect a woman's reputation or unravel it, and because of that power, she learned restraint. Many children entered the world without names, without records, without futures promised by law. Some were quietly fostered out. Others were absorbed into households under different identities. Some disappeared entirely, their existence acknowledged only by those present at birth. The midwife stood at the center of these decisions, not as judge, but as witness. She did not choose outcomes, she facilitated them. This distinction mattered. Medieval society depended on plausible order. Lineage, inheritance, and legitimacy formed its spine. A single unacknowledged child could fracture that structure. The midwife's silence preserved continuity. She allowed families to continue pretending coherence where reality had already diverged. This was not cruelty, it was the logic of survival in a world without safety nets. For women, the risk was absolute. Discovery could mean exile, violence, or death. The midwife understood this risk intimately. Her loyalty was practical, not ideological. She sided with life where possible. Sometimes that meant aiding concealment. Other times it meant guiding abandonment. These choices were heavy, carried without recognition or relief. The midwife did not record her actions, she absorbed them. Over time, this accumulation shaped her into a living archive of secrets. She knew which houses hid shame behind stone walls, which families owed their stability to her discretion, which children grew up never knowing why their beginnings were quiet. The church preached order, law enforced lineage, but the midwife navigated the spaces where those systems failed. She operated between rules, not against them. Her work did not dismantle morality, it compensated for its limits. In this sense, she was neither rebel nor enforcer. She was a mediator between ideal and fact. This mediation extended to moments society feared most: when a pregnancy could not continue, when a body could not endure, when death arrived before confession. The midwife was there, hands steady, voice low, keeping panic from becoming spectacle. Her presence ensured that disruption remained contained, that tragedy did not spill into public disorder. In this way, she protected the same structures that excluded her. This paradox defined her existence. She was indispensable precisely because she was invisible, and invisibility granted her freedom of movement. She passed through thresholds others could not. Bedrooms, back rooms, places where names were unnecessary. As listeners, we may feel the weight of these unnamed lives. They do not appear in genealogies or records, yet they existed. They breathed, cried, and were held, if only briefly. The midwife bore witness to them all. History's silence is not absence, it is containment, and the midwife was its guardian. As this part unfolds, allow the stillness to deepen. These stories were never meant to be told loudly. They were meant to be carried quietly, from one generation to the next, without disturbing the fragile surface of order. There were moments when the medieval midwife stood at the edge of life itself, where continuation was no longer possible and doctrine offered no shelter. These were the moments society preferred not to name, when pregnancy threatened a woman's survival, when the body weakened beyond recovery, when birth meant death rather than beginning. In such rooms, morality did not disappear, but it fell silent. The midwife understood this silence. It was not permission, it was necessity. She worked in a world where official teaching offered certainty, but bodies did not comply. Pain arrived unevenly. Blood did not wait for prayer. Time did not pause for judgment. The midwife acted because waiting meant loss. Her knowledge, inherited quietly across generations of women, included ways to ease suffering when outcomes were already decided. This knowledge was never celebrated. It was feared, because it acknowledged a truth authority resisted. Not all lives could be saved, and not all endings could be called sin. When a pregnancy could not continue, the midwife did not speak of philosophy. She spoke of breath, of strength, of what the body could endure. Her decisions were practical, rooted in proximity to death. She carried the weight of those decisions alone. There were no absolutions for her, no public forgiveness, only the understanding that without her intervention, suffering would multiply. The Church's teachings remained intact because someone else absorbed the contradiction. That someone was the midwife. In these spaces, death was a constant companion. Women died in childbirth frequently. Infants did not survive the night. The midwife became familiar with endings that left no mark on history. She closed eyes, she cleaned bodies, she whispered prayers that were never recorded. Her presence prevented panic from spreading. She transformed loss into quiet departure. This was a form of care unrecognized by doctrine, mercy without language. The midwife did not challenge belief, she made belief survivable. By containing tragedy, she allowed society to continue pretending order was intact. This containment required emotional endurance. She could not grieve openly. Grief would expose what could not be explained. So she carried sorrow inward, adding it to the growing archive of memory she held alone. Over time, this burden shaped her. She moved through villages as a figure both respected and avoided, needed but kept at distance, because she had seen what happened when ideals met flesh. Her silence was not empty. It was full of names never spoken, lives never counted, decisions never confessed. This silence functioned as a boundary. It protected families from collapse. It protected institutions from scrutiny. It protected the living from unbearable truth. As listeners, we may feel the discomfort of this arrangement. It asks us to accept that morality sometimes survives by not looking too closely, that compassion can exist outside language, that order is often preserved by those willing to hold its contradictions quietly. The midwife did not seek this role. It found her, and once found, it shaped her entire existence. She lived knowing that history would never acknowledge her labor, yet without her, history's orderly appearance would have shattered repeatedly. As this part unfolds, allow the pace to slow even further. These moments were never meant for speed. They were meant for stillness. The medieval world slept easier because someone else stayed awake, hands steady in the dark, doing what could not be spoken aloud. The medieval midwife lived in a space defined by contradiction. She was trusted with life, yet suspected of death. Called in moments of crisis, yet watched in moments of calm. Her knowledge saved women, but it also frightened those who could not understand it. This fear shaped her social position. She was neither fully inside the community nor entirely outside it. She moved along its edges, welcomed when needed, kept at a distance when not. The same hands that brought children into the world were believed capable of taking life away. This belief did not emerge from superstition alone. It arose from proximity. The midwife was present when outcomes were uncertain, when survival was not guaranteed, when prayers failed. In a society that needed explanations, proximity to unexplained events bred suspicion. When infants died suddenly, when mothers did not recover, when outcomes contradicted hope, people searched for causes. The midwife, always present, became a convenient answer. Her knowledge of herbs, of timing, of the body's thresholds blurred into fear of hidden influence. Healing and harm became indistinguishable in the public imagination. This ambiguity placed her in danger. Accusations did not require proof, they required discomfort. And discomfort followed her everywhere. Yet society could not function without her. This dependence created tension. Communities protected her and threatened her at the same time. They relied on her skills while policing her behavior. She learned to navigate this instability carefully. She spoke little. She acted precisely. She avoided visibility. Her survival depended on remaining useful but unremarkable. Too much success invited envy. Too much failure invited blame. This narrow path demanded constant vigilance. Over time, the line between midwife and witch grew thin in many regions. Both were women with knowledge outside male authority. Both worked with bodies, herbs, and unseen processes. Both operated beyond written law. When fear intensified, distinctions collapsed. The midwife understood this risk. She adjusted her practices to appear orthodox. She invoked prayer alongside practice. She framed knowledge as tradition, not innovation. These gestures were not deception, they were shields. They allowed her to continue working without attracting accusation. This adaptation reveals another layer of her role. She was not only a witness to hidden life, she was a strategist of survival. Her silence extended beyond secrets of birth and death. It included silence about herself. She erased her own presence to protect her function. This self-effacement was costly. It denied her recognition. It isolated her emotionally. Yet it preserved her ability to act. As listeners, we may sense the quiet loneliness of this position. To be needed and feared simultaneously. To hold knowledge and never claim it. To be close to life's beginning and end without belonging fully to either. This loneliness was not incidental, it was structural. Society required someone to stand in that place so others would not have to. The midwife accepted this burden not as a calling, but as a condition of existence. She did not argue for legitimacy, she practiced it. And in doing so, she held together a fragile system built on ideals that reality constantly challenged. Her presence allowed communities to believe in order, even as they lived with its failures. When suspicion faded, gratitude appeared quietly. When gratitude faded, suspicion returned. This cycle never resolved, it simply continued. The midwife endured because she learned to move with it rather than against it. As this part unfolds, let the tension soften rather than sharpen. This is not a story of persecution alone. It is a story of endurance through ambiguity. The midwife survived not by confronting fear, but by outlasting it. And in outlasting it, she became one of history's most essential and most invisible figures. By the time we reach the end of this chapter, the medieval midwife no longer appears as a single figure, but as a quiet principle running beneath history itself. She was not an exception, she was a function. Where queens crossed boundaries through power, where festivals crossed them through ritual, where ancient Rome crossed them through tradition, the midwife crossed them through silence. This silence was not empty, it was active. It held society together when ideals failed to match lived reality. Medieval history often presents itself as rigid, moral, and orderly. Yet beneath that surface, life moved unevenly. Desire ignored law. Bodies ignored doctrine. Death ignored prayer. The midwife existed precisely to manage these fractures. She absorbed what could not be resolved. She carried what could not be acknowledged, and by doing so, she allowed continuity. Without her, contradictions would have surfaced too often, too visibly. Families would have fractured, authority would have been questioned, order would have revealed itself as fragile. The midwife prevented this not by enforcing rules, but by knowing when they could not apply. Her wisdom was not philosophical, it was situational. She understood that survival sometimes required discretion rather than judgment, that mercy sometimes required silence rather than speech. In this way, she embodied a form of ethics older than law and quieter than belief, an ethics practiced, not proclaimed. This is why history rarely names her. Naming would require explanation. Explanation would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny would expose the compromises that allowed society to function. Instead, history chose silence. It recorded kings, laws, and battles. It left the midwife in the margins, where she had always worked. Yet her absence from records does not mean absence of reality. It means success, the success of a system that depended on unseen labor to maintain its image. As listeners, we can now see the pattern clearly. Power bends rules. Ritual suspends them. Tradition normalizes them. Silence sustains them. Each chapter of this journey revealed a different method of managing human excess. None of them erased desire. None eliminated fear. They simply redirected it. The medieval midwife was the final safeguard. When all other mechanisms failed, she remained. Not celebrated, not condemned, just present. And presence in a world of uncertainty was everything. As the centuries moved forward, her role slowly transformed. Medicine institutionalized what she once carried alone. Law claimed authority over bodies it had never fully understood. Records expanded, silence narrowed. Yet even today, echoes of her function remain. In every system that relies on unseen care, in every structure that appears orderly because someone absorbs its disorder quietly. The medieval world slept because someone stayed awake in its shadows, not watching over power, but over people, not guarding ideals, but guarding lives as they actually were. And so, as this story settles, we arrive at a simple truth. History was never as orderly as it pretended to be. It only learned when to close its eyes. And in those moments, when it chose not to see, someone else chose to stay, listening, holding, witnessing. That was the midwife's work. And in that work, she carried the world forward without ever asking to be remembered. Now, let the pace slow completely. The rooms grow quiet. The voices fade. The contradictions rest. Tonight, you do not need to resolve them. You only need to notice that they were always there, and that someone, long ago, made sure they did not wake the world.